The Gilded Age is produced by Universal Television and brought to you by HBO of Warner Media. All characters, plot points, and footage are property of HBO. The Gilded Age is a brand new drama airing exclusively on HBO Max. Join your friends at Free Tours by Foot as we take you through New York City, showing you actual locations from the show, locations in New York City the show is based around, discuss plot points, and go over the actual history of all of the events of the Gilded Age. And remember to book your tour with freetoursbyfoot.com the next time you visit New York City or any one of our other locations. And now, on to Katherine.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to be talking some more about the Gilded Age, about the most recent episode. As you can see, we're changing up format again. We're going back to this sort of podcast chat style episode just for this week because of what has unfolded in the most recent episode, rather than there being a lot of different New York City locations that were very recognizable in this episode. A lot of the storyline that has unfolded was very, very dramatic, but has been mostly playing out inside the houses, inside offices. But as we are seeing is pretty typical with the Gilded Age, a lot of it is based on real historic events. So we're going to go into some of those. We'll talk a little bit about what was behind these. And in some ways, it can also help us maybe somewhat predict what's going to happen next. So let's start with the most dramatic of the storylines this week, which was the railroad crash, which we really saw at the end of the last episode. We just didn't start to really learn any of the details of it until this go round. But we do believe that this one was based on a historic event. Railroad crashes were sadly not uncommon back then, but we think this particular crash was based on one that would have happened the same year that the Gilded Age was set, which was 1882. So this one happened just outside of New York City. Yeah?
Yeah, so it happened in January 1882 in the Spuyten-Duyvil section of the Bronx, where one train turned the corner and stalled, and another train came up behind it fairly quickly and hit it. And I believe about 10 people died. One of them was a senator. And it really was at the time they didn't have technologies for trains to talk to each other. So the train in the back didn't know there was a train in the front. Yeah.
So obviously, like, different scenario than what we're seeing in the Gilded Age. And what they're doing in the show is arguably a little more dramatic, because rather than something like, hey, the technology just didn't exist, it happened, it was kind of a freak accident. They very clearly, by the end of the episode, have shown that this is because someone is at fault.
Right.
Someone made a bad call and they put these faulty axles on the engine. And George Russell, of course, thinks by the end of the episode he knows who it is.
He says they found the man responsible for the axles. His name is Dixon. He's the head of the team that built the engine.
But the question is, what's the fallout going to look like for him personally? Because he's still the owner. And technically his company is at fault. And by the end, they're even talking like, it's not just about like, oh, are we going to lose money? Is our stock price going to fall? I mean, they could face criminal charges for this. People have died. I mean, he could go to prison. And I think this is also one of the first times we're seeing real tension between the Russells. Not that they haven't bickered a little bit back and forth, but this is where they really seem to be at odds with each other, because he is thinking about, like, 5 people are dead. Someone is at fault. I need to know who it is. I could go to jail. And she's thinking about it more from a PR standpoint.
Because I heard today that Mr. McAllister wants to come here for luncheon. What do you think of that?
Well, if you're asking, I think the fact that 5 men are dead and a member of my staff has blood on his hands is a little more important than whether or not the great Ward McAllister comes here for luncheon.
It matters, George. I've worked for this, and it matters to me, even if it doesn't to you.
Well, you're right there. I don't give a rat's ass when Mr. McAllister breaks his bread.
And he could be thinking it from that standpoint as well, because if there's 10 people dead, he needs someone to blame.
They'll know we have a killer on our payroll, and we need to make it clear it isn't me.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely. And you can tell he's very like almost single-minded and like, we need to figure out whose decision that was, because
Right.
that's going to become the fall guy when they figure out who that is. And unfortunately, by the end of the episode, they figured out who it is, but that person says that they have proof that it was George Russell's call to make that substitution. So I think this is something we're going to be seeing probably throughout several episodes coming up. I don't think this is just going to be a 2-episode thing. I think this will be probably for the rest of the season. Right. Which we're going to see that play out. But this is where it's interesting, because as we're looking at the Russells in these episodes, and you're seeing them, at first they seem very united. They go to the crash site. They're talking to Clara Barton. They make this giant donation.
Thank you, Mr. Russell.
But then they do start to diverge a little bit, and he starts to try to deal with the business side, the legal side, the practical side, and she's starting to veer off and deal with the social side of it.
No, I meant the damage to us, you and me. Can you manage the papers?
Yeah, and how that's going to work. And I know we've talked on this show so far that they really seem to be basing the Russells on a couple of different real historic people. But the further we get into the show, it seems like the more closely they are basing them on some of these people. This railroad storyline is really starting to take on a lot of elements of Jay Gould for George Russell. Not that train crashes didn't happen to other people.
Right. And the family aspect as well.
Absolutely. Because that is one of the things. While Jay Gould is known as being one of the robber barons of the age, and he had some very, we call it questionable business practices, he was a real family man. Right. He was married to his wife until she died. They had like 6 children or something, a large family. And he was very, very devoted to his family, which amongst the upper class of New York City was not always the case. And that's something we've seen so far with the Russells, is they seem to have this very committed marriage, a lot like Jay Gould and his wife did. Whereas you don't necessarily see that in some of the other couples in the series. And a lot of that seems to be that I don't get the impression, though they haven't really talked a lot about how George and Bertha met, I don't get the impression that he was already wealthy when they met.
It doesn't seem that way, because they seem so much of a partnership, and very well paired as a couple too. Right. Yeah.
Like, I think they got married because they loved each other, which, in a family like, for example, the Van Ryns, I definitely don't get the impression that Agnes married her husband because of any particular affection for him. A lot of survival. Mm-hmm. Survival, and really amongst a lot of those old Knickerbocker families, it was about, your lineage. It was about the meshing of fortunes. It was sometimes more of a political or society maneuver than it was to do with, them really liking each other. So I think we are seeing that with George and Bertha's relationship so far, and that, they do seem really well matched. They seem like partners. Until this episode, when they're starting to clash a little bit more. And it's interesting because while he seems very based on Jay Gould, so far she has seemed so incredibly based on Alva Vanderbilt.
Yes, I agree with that.
Which is interesting because at some point, those historic storylines would really, really diverge from one another. While Jay Gould was happily married and seemed very committed to his family, Alva Vanderbilt got divorced from her husband. Right. Which was unusual and very scandalous, honestly, at the time. She divorced her husband. And so I don't think that's what they're setting up in the Gilded Age at all. But if they're not, then that would maybe impact some of what they end up doing with her character. Historically, and we talked in our last episode about Gladys and kind of the trajectory they seem to be taking with Gladys, and raised the possibility is her mother setting her up to do something like what happened with Consuelo Vanderbilt?
Right.
And try to marry her off. They called them dollar princesses when these heiresses would marry these titled Europeans. And so that did happen. But, you know, when that happened, it wasn't entirely because of this, but it was a large part influenced by the fact that Alva Vanderbilt had gotten divorced.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very scandalous. And that had kind of dinged her social standing a little bit. And so the opportunity of, you know, wiping the slate clean with this really illustrious marriage for her daughter, you know, that was why there was so much at stake for her.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see where they decide to go with this. Again, if we're going purely off history, these would start spiraling off in different directions. So they'll definitely have to choose, I think, one way or the other. What do you think they're going to do?
Well, I think they're going to go along the lines of the Alva Vanderbilt and marrying off her daughter to someone she doesn't love. I
Poor Gladys.
Yeah, I don't see how this would go any other way. I believe that's what's going to happen.
I don't either. It's so interesting. I kept waiting in the last couple episodes. I was like, oh, maybe Gladys gets to be happy. Maybe she gets to do this.
Yeah, that's a big no.
I don't think it is. I think,
Right.
I mean, gosh, it seems like she might finally get a coming out ball this year. Maybe.
What I do see is Carrie, Astor, kind of this, my prediction is the same storyline, but on the Astor side of the family.
Yes.
And I think Carrie befriends, this is just my prediction, that Carrie befriends Gladys so that she could get closer to Larry, and Larry's the man that she's talking about that her mother doesn't approve of.
Yes, I think because every time Carrie and Larry, oh my God, every time Carrie and Larry have met, they do seem to have this real connection. And of course, this is where it gets dicey because Carrie Astor was a real person,
Right.
And the Russells are a completely fictional family, but. I do know that I believe historically Carrie Astor did marry someone that was considered not quite acceptable by her family. I mean, granted, the list of who would have been acceptable by her mother's standards would have been, I don't know, 4 people. But I do think she ended up marrying somebody that would have kind of fallen more into the mold of Larry Russell. So maybe they go that way. And just, kind of abandon the history of it at some point.
Or it could be a storyline for a while because it shows that contrast between Bertha not wanting her daughter to marry someone who she loves, and then Mrs. Astor saying that the Russells weren't good enough or something.
It is interesting because it was fun when the two women met at this creepy doll tea party.
And is this your sister? We were wondering what we were supposed to do with the dolls.
They do have that connection of, yes, you're an Astor and you're a Russell and you're, on kind of opposite ends of society, but they do have a really similar issue in that their mothers are just so domineering for completely different reasons. The Astors because they're trying to keep families like the Russells at arm's length, and the Russells because they're desperately trying to leap into that circle. But yeah, no, that was like a quick bonding moment.
Yeah. I find interesting that they keep weaving Mamie Fish into the story, but she's not on the forefront. She was a really interesting person as well.
So interesting. And I keep waiting for them to put her in more because apparently historically she was kind of a character. I mean, so, and you've seen it, I guess, in the little, obviously she threw this weird doll tea party, but even in Newport, when we saw her in the first episode, she was known for kind of like lobbing zingers at her guests. Like, even though she had invited them, like she was not mean, but
She liked to make people uncomfortable. It was fun for her.
She
like
did.
a doll tea party type uncomfortable.
So weird. They walked in and I was like, oh.
We all pick a doll and we make sure they have enough to eat and drink throughout the afternoon.
What do we do now?
I don't know. Not pick a doll.
God. You could see Larry's face, like, why am I here right now?
Right.
Like, what is happening? But one of the things, like a good historic example is something she would do is somebody would show up at one of Mamie Fish's parties and she'd be like, oh, you're here. I forgot I even invited you. And people would be like, I don't know what to do with that.
Mamie gets these wild ideas for her parties, but people pay no attention.
So yeah, I would love to see her become a little bit more involved.
And then I wonder if she will, because the historical figures, the actual real people aren't playing, they're not the lead roles in the story, the fictional ones are.
Right, they're not, which I think is smart because it leaves them open. They don't have to go with, okay, well, this person actually ended up doing this. They're able to kind of use these fictional people who are really mashups of a lot of different historic figures.
Right.
And then they can kind of chart their own course. But just so everybody knows, historically, what really ended up happening is when Mrs. Caroline Astor finally kind of gave up her role as like the leading society matron, the joke was it took 3 women to replace her. And Mamie Fish was one of those women. So she did eventually end up stepping into that kind of Caroline Astor role as one of the gatekeepers of society. And just as a symbol of how much the tides really started to shift, one of the others was Alva Vanderbilt, who was by then remarried. She was Alva Belmont by then, and she had remarried. But both of them ended up filling that role partially at the end of Mrs. Astor's life. So yeah, I would imagine we'll still see Mrs. Fish on the fringes, but I hope she pops up every now and then to just do weird things to make people uncomfortable.
Julian Fellows, if you're watching this.
If you're watching.
More Mamie Fish.
Yes, like something along the lines of the doll tea party, because that was perfect. It was uncomfortable to watch.
Imagine trying to find props for the doll tea party.
It was just... And it was funny because when they first said the invitation, when they talked about the invitation at the dinner table, I was like, oh, I wonder what that's going to look like. Like, maybe they just all hold a doll. I don't know that I even went to like, no, they have to hold a doll and pretend to feed a doll for an afternoon.
That's what they meant.
You know, people did do some strange entertaining back then, though. I mean, that was kind of the thing is, since everybody threw big grand parties, if you were in kind of the upper class of New York City, if you really wanted to set yourself apart, you really couldn't do same old, same old.
Right.
You needed to have the grand party, but there needed to be some kind of something to set it apart.
And Mrs. Astor embodied that. And I saw that in elements of Bertha's luncheon with McAllister, with the flowers that were, you know, he was impressed. How did you get these flowers at this time of year?
Next, he will make the blind see and the lame walk.
She would do, I think at one party she spent $10,000 on roses.
Yes, because it was like the dead of winter. And that was the whole point, was to make people walk in and like Ward McAllister say, like, how on earth did she get roses?
Right.
She must be all powerful.
And the gifts to her dinner gifts as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought about that as well when she was having this luncheon and they're unwrapping their napkins and there's these amazing gifts inside. I loved Ward McAllister's comment, nothing is ever too much.
Nothing is ever too much for me.
As he gets this, I mean, pretty gaudy case.
Yes.
But
which I'm curious if that was a cigarette case or.
I think it is. I think it was meant to be a cigarette case. But yeah, I mean, for people like Ward McAllister and Bertha Russell, there's no such thing as too much.
Right.
Too much is the point because you remember it. So yeah, entertaining could take some strange turns back then because you wanted to stand out. And so I guess in Mrs. Fish's case, that meant creepy doll tea party. For someone like Mrs. Astor, it was finding the thing that's impossible to find at this time of year. Another really popular kind of power play move back then was to do a dessert based on strawberries in like the dead of winter because you weren't supposed to be able to find them anywhere.
Right.
So yeah, there was a lot of the, a rare ingredient or a rare place setting or some crazy gift.
Right. And it really shows up how much money you have that you can find strawberries in winter.
Absolutely. Or that you can just, casually give everybody sitting down for lunch this insane jeweled, gold-plated thing.
Although those fans were really nice.
I loved those fans. I want one of those fans if there are any props left over from the show. I really loved that. And it was interesting to see, her kind of starting to make this move finally into what she wants. I mean, this is, I think, the first time she's even had people over to this giant house.
Formally, yeah.
Formally. I mean, she had her at-home evening that was such a complete bust.
Right.
But, now she's got Ward McAllister and Aurora Fane and her husband, and she's giving them gold things.
Right.
So it definitely seems like, in terms of like the rest of the season, Bertha Russell seems situated right now to get everything she wants.
Right.
I mean, that could certainly change it, and it might end up being, what is really the aftermath of the train crash?
Right.
What does that end up looking like? That could really start to shift the family's focus on what they need to be doing.
Right.
But I guess we'll see.
But I'll say George Russell said this man has written proof, and by his demeanor, I would say this man really doesn't.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, I will say this, George Russell seemed genuinely shocked that this had happened and that it was because of this error.
Right.
He did seem genuinely surprised, and he has seemed genuinely upset that this has happened. So, yeah, I'm with you. I guess I'm inclined to believe at this point that George Russell really isn't at fault.
Right.
But again, because he's the owner, that doesn't necessarily mean he won't be found responsible by the law or by society. This could still cause a lot of problems for the Russells, whether or not we find out that George is really responsible or not. But we will all have to find out. We have
a little bit of drama.
Well, we have 4 more episodes, right? In the first season.
Episode 6. So I think there's a total of 9. There's a total of 9, yeah.
So yeah, I do think we'll have some kind of resolution of at least the train derailment by the end of the season. I'm hoping for resolution of that. Gladys's coming out party, however that's going to happen.
Right.
And seeing what's going to go on with the Van Ryn household, because there's drama over there too.
This is too much.
Right.
So
I loved the ending of that of that episode.
I will say, never has a line been better delivered than heads have rolled for less.
she delivers it so well.
Oh, so good.
Heads have rolled for less.
And I was actually surprised. And I don't know. Tell me what you think. For me, I think it is a bit of a historic leap that Bannister would have taken that kind of risk and done that. I don't know. $100 was a lot of money.
Yeah, I looked it up. $100 in 1882 was $2,600 something. That's for one luncheon.
Right. To go over for what? Probably 3 hours end to end.
At the most. Yeah.
And, tell people where to put forks. I mean, that's that. So, I mean, I do get that. I guess I was surprised at what makes it so uncomfortable is because of the proximity of the houses.
Right.
You had to think someone's going to find out. I don't know that I thought that was going to happen, during
in the
lunch.
way that it's right.
But who do you think sent the note? I think it was Church.
Yeah, it was Church, because remember he said, "I'll be right back. I have to do something."
Yeah,
I'll be back in a moment.
Definitely think it was Church. I mean, I haven't said yet, but I think that's the obvious answer. I mean, look, Bannister's on his turf. This is, this is his livelihood. And that would be a real slap in the face to somebody, because
it's a theme too at the downstairs. Mm-hmm. Where now his job is threatened, and Miss Armstrong feels threatened, and the Irish girl, I'm sorry, I forgot her name. She felt, these right. comments about other people taking their jobs or reacting to situations as if their jobs are a threat.
Right. Because exactly like there was with the upper class, there was a very strict hierarchy amongst the servants.
Right.
And that was important to them because that very much affected what kind of job you could get next. That affected how much money you made. It affected what your position was in the household. Right. For someone like Church, I mean, the butler ran the household. You are in right. charge. You are at the top of the servant pyramid. And so somebody moving in on your territory. I mean, you could see when she said, Bannister, would you come in and just take the lead? And he's like, well, what am I supposed to do?
Right.
Because you could see when Bannister was like, okay, we're all getting ready. He doesn't want to take orders from somebody else.
Right.
He feels like that is his job. The only people he takes orders from are the Russells.
And plus, he's an American butler, where Bannister is an English butler. And what if the Russells want an English style service?
Right.
So then he would be out of it. He would really be out of the job.
He would be. I mean, because I find it very easy to believe that the Russells could wave way more money in front of Bannister than the Van Ryns can, right. and make him a pretty appealing offer,
right.
to, jump to the other side of the street. And they very well may do that, because it seems like Mrs. Russell was very surprised, and it was clearly new information to her. The English style service is what all of these Knickerbocker families use.
Right.
You could tell she didn't know that.
And why would she? If she wasn't spending a lot of time with the old families, how, perhaps she wouldn't know that.
She wouldn't know that, but now she does. And so is she going to feel like, this is really important and I need to do this? Or does she have some kind of loyalty to Church? And a lot of that may depend on, and they haven't talked about the backstories of a lot of the servants at the Russells yet. Right. How long have they been with them? If Church has been with the family for a while, they might feel some loyalty to him. But if he's relatively new, then probably to Bertha Russell, one butler's very much the same as another butler, especially if the other butler can do exactly what I need him to do, which is English service.
And I think too, with these aristocratic families in England, their roles, and I would think this would carry over to the US, mm-hmm. the roles of being employers was very important to them. So it wasn't an easy decision to let someone go, whereas right. these American money and new money at that may not have seen loyalty, especially if you have more of a robber baron mindset, mm-hmm. then loyalty wouldn't be so important for Church as opposed right. to the Van Ryns with Bannister. Right. And also, for people watching this, the butler was the head. He was the top of the food chain in the downstairs.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think one of the other differences that we're seeing here, and we're starting to see this unfold a little bit, and this would be a real departure if you're somebody that watched Downton Abbey, for example, Julian Fellowes' best known show. And even though you still have this downstairs, you have the servants, they have this hierarchy, they have their own rules and their own goings on. I think one of the differences that you would see, because that took place in England and this is taking place during the Gilded Age in New York, servants in the Gilded Age would have felt empowered to have different aspirations for themselves than, say, a servant in Downton Abbey. Because whereas, somebody saying, okay, I work in service, this is what I do, this is what my family has done, this is where I am on the social ladder. The Gilded Age in New York, everything kind of got flipped upside down because you have people like George and Bertha Russell. And they've said Bertha Russell's father dug potatoes. Well, and here she is. And now she's the lady of this, palace on Fifth Avenue. And so if you're a servant in that household, you might be sitting there saying, well, why not me?
Right.
Why not me? If they did it, I can do it. And so you're seeing people, again, with some different aspirations rather than, whereas I think where you'd see somebody in Downton Abbey or even across the street in the Van Rhines maybe saying, oh, well, right now I'm a kitchen maid. Maybe someday I'll work my way up to an upstairs maid and then to a lady's maid.
Right.
I don't think that's what we're seeing.
You think, and in these big homes in England, just big homes in England, you live in a village. So how much opportunity do you have outside of the job that you have, where, finding your way up the ladder? Whereas in New York, and this, and we're still settling the country at this point. There's so much space for expansion in our country that you don't have to work at the home.
Jack, the kid over at the Van Rhines, could be like, screw it. I'm going to pack up and take a train out west and go, pan for gold. and he could do that. But so rather than whereas again, Jack probably, if you're talking about England, would have been saying, okay, well, someday I'm going to be the butler. I'm going to, learn to do what Bannister does. I don't know that that's necessarily even the norm. I think people tended, again, because you were seeing it play out in real time. You were seeing people who came from absolutely nothing building these enormous fortunes. And so it made it seem not necessarily likely, but doable, at least. And that's very different. That's a really different mentality than something like Downton Abbey.
And I think that's why, Downton Abbey focused on one family, where this in New York, in this time period, it needed to be focused on two families because the dynamics between the old and the new money were so different. And even in the downstairs, the dynamics were so different in a new country, in a big city, in a fast growing city. And the city is still growing at this point.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, and I think you do see those differences between the downstairs of the Van Rhines and the Russells. Obviously in size, because the Russells have significantly more servants than the Van Rhines do. But the Van Rhines, they run things in a very traditional way. You're going to see it more like you would see something in Downton Abbey. Anytime they start to discuss anything with the household, Bannister will always come and shut it down, be like, that's not for us to say. That's not for us to say. We shouldn't be talking about them. That doesn't really happen at the Russells. You see some of the servants, and especially Turner, Mrs. Russell's lady's maid, she does think it's for her to say. She thinks she should have more say than Mrs. Russell because she knows what she's doing.
So in the old money families, they are fostering a sense of loyalty back from upstairs, between upstairs and downstairs, with the old money, which is the English style, which goes back to, one of the purposes is being an employer. That was important to these large families, and not so much in the new money, because their goals were different.
And it is interesting because you see this just utter shock on Mrs. Van Ryn's face that Bannister would dare.
How can I refuse?
Bannister, do my eyes deceive me?
Be over there. And I actually just thought about, like, so what if the situation was reversed? What if Mrs. Russell found out for some reason her butler, jumped ship for an afternoon over the Van Ryns? I don't know that she'd have the same reaction. I don't know that it would be this absolute appalled, oh my God, I can't believe it. This is the ultimate betrayal. She'd be upset.
Right.
But I don't think, because to your point, I don't know that they've fostered that same kind of relationship.
Right.
I don't know that what she'd be feeling would be quite as dramatic.
Right. I agree with that.
So it's interesting to see them start to develop the servant characters a little bit more, because they kind of didn't for the first few episodes. They were there were some little things, but they haven't really had a lot of character development. Now we're starting to see it a little bit more. We've seen Mrs. Armstrong venture out into this completely different part of New York City. We've seen Bannister decide to take $100 and run across the street.
Right.
So, we'll have to, we've seen Turner across the street be like, hey, I'm going to go spy for Oscar Van Ryn.
And it's not for the money.
She's an interesting character. She's definitely one that, speaking of servants that do not see their life as I'm a servant, I think she's got big plans for herself. And I think she and Bertha Russell are probably more alike than either of them think they are.
Yes, I agree with that.
She's clearly made a very obvious play for George Russell, which he turned down. But now she's throwing her lot in with Oscar Van Ryn. And to be honest, I'm not even really sure what her end game is yet.
I mean, Oscar seems to think it's revenge. I would say money would be the goal.
I think money is the goal. And I also wonder if part of the end game is, because I think she has spent a lot of time in high society in New York. And I think as a lady's maid, she probably has been privy to some of the inner workings of some households. I'm wondering if her end game is, if she helps Oscar land Gladys, then he's going to be very, very grateful to her, first of all. And he's also going to have a lot more money at his disposal than he had before.
True. Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, is she hoping for some kind of big payout? Or I don't know that she'd be hoping for like a position in their household, because that doesn't seem to line up with what she has said so far. Or heck, maybe she's going to make a play for Oscar herself. I don't know. I don't think so.
I think she wants something bigger than that. Yeah,
she does. Yeah. So it'll be interesting, because they've clearly set up that they have this alliance, but I don't know. I don't know where it's going yet.
Right.
So we'll have to wait. It's
probably not going to go in Oscar's favor in the long run.
No. Honestly, Oscar just wants to marry Gladys. I think Gladys just wants to, marry somebody she halfway likes.
And be comfortable.
Yeah. It's there's definitely a lot that's starting to shift. I think one of the other things that's a pretty dramatic shift has been as we've started to see Clara Barton becoming a bigger character.
Right.
And the Red Cross becoming kind of taking over, it seems like, as like the charity du jour that all of the society women are working with. But you're starting to see that shift within the charity and how this is running from the old to the new, because now all of a sudden, Mrs. Morris, who has been, it seems like one of these charity, leaders, is kind of on the outskirts because she won't accept Mrs. Russell. And my God, they're even going to Mrs. Chamberlain for money now.
Well, I find this interesting, a dynamic as well, because how strategic the charity people were as well. I mean, Clara Barton in the storyline is playing her cards to get the biggest donations.
And you know what? And it's interesting because this is the first time, and they've been talking about charity work since the first episode. This is what women did back then. Right. But it's interesting because this is the first time I've ever heard the shift from, well, it's about charity, it's about appearances, and it's about meeting people, and it's about this and who you're associating with. And Clara Barton has now very bluntly said, well, who cares who they are? What we're trying to do is raise money to help people.
I would like to remind you that no one in this city has done more real good for my cause.
Right.
And they have money.
Yeah.
And you haven't heard that yet. I mean, it's been about, keeping the circle really small and, I guess we're helping people too, but that hasn't seemed like the focus. And now it's seeming like, yeah, we're going to do this because this is really what it's for. It's really for raising money for helping people.
Right.
And I'll be interested to see how Mrs. Chamberlain maybe starts to work into it as well. I mean, in the first episode, I think they would have thought that was absolutely inconceivable that they were even talking about it, but they would have said that about Mrs. Russell too. And now she's, a committee chairperson.
Right. Right. But Mrs. Chamberlain seems to really be isolated.
She does. So we'll have to see what happens with that. It seems like she's going to become a bigger part of the story since she's offered to help Marion out as being like a meeting place for Marion and Henry Raikes. And I guess in that way, acting as their chaperone as well.
An audience, can we talk about this in the comment section?
All right. So what we want to know is what you think about Henry Raikes. Is this genuine or is he bad news?
We talk about it every episode.
Every single episode. And I just cannot escape the feeling that he is bad news.
He is bad news.
I think he is. I think everything that I've seen of him so far, especially as compared with like my knowledge of the time period, just really aligns with like he has some bad intentions.
He's like, he's got impulse control. He just shows up in New York. I'm just going to move here after meeting Marion 3 times. And then he asked her to marry him after, I don't know how many meetings.
3 or 4, maybe. I mean, right. It's very, very brief. And I mean, honestly, I don't even count their first couple of meetings because he was her lawyer. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're talking about her father's will and how to deal with, the fact that she's penniless. Like, it's not like he's reading her poetry. I mean, right. I would consider that first meeting at the Van Rhijns to be like the first time they've really spent social time together.
Right.
And yet, yeah, he proposes to her like, I don't know,
and
a
then
minute later.
Then he plans the whole Danville trip, which today is like a 5-hour drive by car. So I don't know how much by train that would have been.
So far away. And he's chosen the accommodations. And I know this is something you and I talked about. In that time period, if you had a man who was interested in a young society woman like Marion Brooke, you would never, if you really actually cared about this person and wanted to marry them, you would never even ask, truly.
Right. And he said that's part of what he hoped for.
Yeah, you certainly wouldn't like set up an entire trip and offer to make all the arrangements for accommodations in pursuit of this idea. Because, I mean, again, this is a different time period. Had that happened, first of all, someone would have found out because they just would have. They were all in this one hotel together. And Marion would have been considered ruined.
So
that was it.
If you love her, then why would you ruin her? And if you were trying to entrap her because you want her money, she doesn't have any. So what's the end game there?
Nothing adds up.
Right.
Nothing adds up with Henry Raikes. And he clearly does seem to want this elite society of New York. I mean, he even says in this recent episode, oh, I have this ball I'm going to the opera again this week. I'm going out to a house party on Long Island. I mean, he has this very busy social calendar. So he seems to want this. And so his proposal to Marion doesn't really line up with that. And she's even said that, if you and I get married, we don't get to live like this.
Right. And he's a lawyer. So how much money going to all these parties isn't going to change how much money he has. So to continue that lifestyle, he would have to marry someone within that lifestyle with money, or who would at least get invited to those parties, which I guess Marion still could get invited to those parties, but they wouldn't be able to afford all those trips.
Right. I mean, they'd still be invited places. It would be a question of they wouldn't be able to keep pace with everyone else. So, you very much would have been, technically still a part of this social class, but you'd be like the very bottom rung of it.
Right.
And kind of always teetering on the edge because really you can't afford it.
Right.
So it's interesting. I guess my personal take is I think he's using Marion as a stepping stone of sorts. I can't quite tell how he's planning to do that, but I think you're spot on. What he really needs is a rich society heiress. And that's not Marion.
Right. But I think he's very impulsive, so he may not have thought any of this through and just like I love her. Oh, wait, maybe I don't. Maybe I love this other lady who's really rich.
So
that's what I think.
Everything about it has just been when he proposed to her, I was like, wait, what's happening? You just met each other.
Even Peggy said that she said that she didn't feel he had a plan.
Right.
It could just be he's got poor impulse control and he's really not planning it out.
Well, and Aunt Agnes keeps using this word adventurer to describe him. Mm-hmm. Like this whole thing is kind of a game to him almost. Right. It's about how far can I go? Where can I get invited? Maybe I can do this. Maybe I can do this. But I think maybe you're right. There's not a lot of thought behind it. And I think certainly not a thought for how all of this affects Marion either.
Right.
But I don't know. Maybe he'll turn out to be a nice guy. I don't think so. I do not have high hopes for Henry Raikes.
I do not, but I would like Miriam and Larry together.
Yeah, I like that too. I do too. I feel like, obviously Larry maybe kind of has a thing for Carrie Astor as well, but I like the Larry Marion matchup myself.
Right.
That's the right one. If you're listening.
I wonder if Bertha would be happy with that, or she cares less.
She might be okay with that. I don't think she feels like who Larry marries matters that much. She doesn't talk about it the same way I think she wants him to marry well. I think she'd be happy with a woman from one of these Knickerbocker families.
Right.
But I think she'd be fine with that. I don't think in her mind, Gladys can make this giant leap into acceptance. But, the interesting thing is, and we've kind of talked about this before, the younger generation here doesn't necessarily see their lives the same way the older generation does. And they're living their lives in a different way than their parents probably did. Right. And so it already seems like Larry is accepted into parts of society that his parents aren't. Right. I mean, he's already going to lunch at the Union Club. He's already getting invited to Newport. He gets invited to Mrs. Fish's parties.
Right.
And I don't think that Mrs. Fish would invite his parents.
So is Larry getting invited to clubs that his father is not allowed into?
I can't tell. They didn't specify what club Mr. Fane was going into. I think Mr. Fane was supposed to be going into the Knickerbocker Club.
Okay.
And they have only referenced the Union Club by name as being a place that Larry has gone.
And that would make sense because the Union Club was seen as more liberal.
Yes.
Whereas
I think it's, yeah.
The Knickerbocker is basically the Knickerbockers, the old New Yorkers.
Yeah. I mean, the Knickerbocker Club was created because they felt like they were letting too many new money people into the Union Club. I would imagine George Russell would be accepted at the Union Club, but it certainly seems like Larry is either way. And again, Larry is getting these invites to Newport, and he's invited to Mrs. Fish's parties. And some of this is because, again, you're talking a younger generation. I mean, Larry has been going to the same schools as the sons of all of these families. He's made friends with them. And that's something his father wouldn't have had an opportunity to do. So that's kind of his gateway in.
And these parties are run by Mamie Fish.
Fabulous. I mean, and maybe it doesn't seem like a great win that Larry's getting invited to the creepy doll tea party, but by society's standards, that's a big deal. This is an old Knickerbocker family. Again, Bertha wasn't invited. Her kids were invited. So there's definitely a disconnect between where Larry is comfortable and accepted and where his parents are. And so I think because of that, maybe his mother would feel like he has more leeway in who he can marry.
Right. And he has the option to have a career and make his own money as well, whereas Gladys did not have that opportunity.
Right. And I will be interested to see what happens. They really just dropped it into this episode that Larry seems to want a different career than the one he has. I guess we'll see where that goes. They really just dropped that in, and he's all of a sudden saying, I want to be an architect, and I'm talking to Meade McKim White. And the truth is, for him, it won't matter very much because either way, you're right, he does have an opportunity to have a career and make money. And you certainly could as an architect during that time period. So even if he switches careers, he'll be okay. And the reality is he's going to inherit a lot of money.
Right.
So it won't matter for him as much what he decides to do, as long as his father is able to hold on to all this money.
Now, I know in England, the women could not inherit. They can have a dowry, but they could not inherit. But was that a thing in the U.S. at this time?
I don't know that it was a rule.
It was more of a societal rule.
I think it was a societal rule. If it was an actual legal precedent in the UK, I don't know that was a legal precedent.
Right.
I think women technically could inherit, but they didn't as a rule. I mean, it'd be more likely that, you would get your dowry, like in the case of Consuelo Vanderbilt, when she was married off to the Duke of Marlborough, he got, $75 million worth, by today's standards, of railroad stock. That was her dowry. That's why he married her. So he got this railroad stock. Now, I guess I don't know, had Consuelo never married, which I'm sure just wouldn't have been an option on the table since she was basically taken to the altar kicking and screaming. Had she never married, would she have just gotten those? And I don't know the answer to that. I think legally she could have.
Because I'm thinking like in the US all the way through the end of 1800s, like women couldn't have careers. Even though near the end of the 1800s, women were getting college degrees, they really didn't have a spot in society to actually have a career. And they were doing service work and charity. That's where their place was if they were going to do something like that, which is what we see in the show.
Right. So I imagine that, because I think this was even true in the UK, you had women who had dowries. And that was that was their inheritance, basically.
Right.
And even if they did not marry, I believe they still got that money. That money was still set aside for them. It was just that, for some people, it wasn't really enough to live off of for the rest of your life.
Right.
It was meant to be like, the incentive gift for your potential husband. So I think Gladys will be a wealthy woman regardless, I would imagine, but her mother clearly wants something from this.
Right.
She wants this absolutely upper echelon glittering marriage for Gladys. And this is the one thing her parents seem to agree on too, when it comes to her, because really that is another area where they clash. I think George Russell thinks Gladys should be out already and she should be able to do this. And Bertha doesn't agree, but where they do seem to agree is that they are like saving Gladys for something bigger.
Right.
That poor girl.
I know.
Because whatever they're saving her for, I'm guessing maybe she's not going to be psyched about.
Right. I agree with that.
We'll see. But some very exciting things happening on the Gilded Age. We will have to wait and see what happens next week with episode 7. I think we're going to see a lot more to do with the train crash fallout. Maybe we're going to start seeing the planning of Gladys's coming out ball, and see a little bit more developing with Marion and Henry Raikes. And maybe a little bit furthering of Peggy's career, because she's had this big triumph. Writing about Clara Barton was a big step forward in her career. And I mean, she certainly seems poised to take some big leaps forward in the newspaper industry. They didn't do as much with her storyline this episode, but I'm guessing that they will coming up, because they've kind of queued it up as, hey, you've had this great accomplishment. So where is she going to go next?
And also, here's more secrets we're not going to tell you about.
What happened? What happened with her dad?
My guess is she's married.
You think? I don't know. Yeah, maybe
she got married in Pennsylvania.
Maybe.
And that's why she needed a Pennsylvania lawyer.
Yeah, could be. I just keep wondering, like, what happened with your dad? Because it seems way too dramatic for, I don't think you should be a writer. Like, I think that's there, but like, I don't know, something happened there.
Yeah.
There's something incredibly dramatic. And I really hope that they decide to at least resolve that this season. And it's not like, well, next season we'll talk about it.
Because, but then there's also that secretiveness with Armstrong that they've added in.
Yeah. There's a lot of secrets. A lot of secrets. And we only have a few episodes left of this first season. So they may leave some secrets hanging. I guess we'll all wait and see, but hopefully this helped you dive into a little bit of the history behind some of this. We certainly obviously have our conjectures based off of our knowledge of the time period and some of the historic figures involved in this, but we'll see if we're right. We may not be. They could go in an entirely different direction. We'll wait and see with all of you, but thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.